Hey guys, welcome back to topic 8.11 of the APUSH curriculum. We are going to be covering today the Civil Rights Movement Expands. That's the title. And so we're going to look at some groups today and see how they were affected by the 1960s call for reforms and greater equality and acceptance of various groups. And we're going to begin by looking at Latin Americans and seeing what path they were on towards equality and greater social and cultural acceptance here in America. So think back to World War II for a moment. You remember in World War II we were talking a little bit about the Bracero program where you had a lot of Mexican laborers coming across the border during World War II to help a lot of the agricultural activity going on, particularly in Southern California. And that is something that would continue then in the decades after World War II. And the conditions for all these workers were pretty awful. I mean, they worked extremely long hours, doing a lot of just physically demanding work in the hot sun, constantly bending over, having to, tend to crops and whatnot. And they weren't being paid very well, and they didn't have a lot of representation, you might say. And so along comes a guy named Cesar Chavez. And Cesar Chavez was born to immigrant parents. He felt a kinship to the people there in working in the fields of southwestern United States, the vegetables and fruits and all that. And he wanted to raise attention and awareness with the average American person that the fruit and vegetables that they were eating was being handled by people who were not getting really what he believed a fair shake at the American way, at the American system. And so he's going to lead peaceful protests and boycotts and eventually gain collective bargaining rights for these workers so that they could get better working conditions, better pay, better hours, and so forth. All right, so let's think back to the Great Society under President Johnson. One of the programs within the Great Society was this overhaul of immigration, that we were going to get rid of the old quota system that had been in place for decades. And as a result of that, with the door more or less opened up to everybody across the world to come to America, the percentage of immigrants who identified as Hispanic or Latin American skyrocketed. And all of a sudden you have more Americans of Latin ancestry than ever before. And this is, it's going to cause some tension in areas that had not seen large numbers of Hispanic Americans before. And out of this this changing demographic situation in America comes something called the Chicano Movement. And the Chicano Movement was this it's in some ways similar to like the Black Panthers we talked about with the Civil Rights Movement. It's a movement dedicated to defeat racism against Latin Americans, to defeat discrimination against Latin Americans, and just kind of a movement of racial pride and awareness. And this idea of America's demographics changing because of immigration is something certainly that people were thinking about in the 1960s and 70s. The legacy of this is, well, I'm going to show you a graph here. In the present day and in the future, the percentage of Americans who identify as Hispanic is going to increase, will continue to increase. These are all projections, of course, but if these projections hold, eventually by the mid part of this century, 30% or so of Americans will be Hispanic. And by the way, the percentage of Americans who are white will eventually decrease to the point where it'll be less than the majority for the first time ever in American history. All right, now let's look at Native Americans and see what's going on in the 1960s. Remember, the 1960s, of course, is a time period of protests and unrest and demands for reform. It's a tumultuous time of change, is really what the 1960s was all about. And Native Americans weren't left out of this. Like the Black Panthers, like the Chicano movement, the Native Americans are going to have their own sort of organization dedicated to overcoming discrimination, bringing back traditions, and it was known as the American Independent Movement. And again, this was established in 1969. And they're trying to bring to attention to America at large that Native Americans had never really been given full access to the American system and the American way, and all those opportunities that come with being Americans. And so they're trying to point to the poverty that was present on many Indian reservations, the lack of employment, educational opportunities, and so forth. But also, this was a movement of kind of trying to awaken Native Americans to what their past was. That your identity as a Cheyenne or Arapaho or Navajo or whatever, that comes with that identity comes cultural traditions and in teachings that maybe have been forgotten, and we need to bring those things back. So in 1969, a group of this movement, the American Independent Movement, Indian movement rather, they occupied Alcatraz. Now, if you're not sure, you've probably heard of Alcatraz, famous prison, right? Well, the Alcatraz prison had been basically abandoned. It was no longer used as a federal prison. It's on an island in San Francisco Harbor. And in 1969, this former prison, which is just standing empty, was occupied by members of the AIM. And they were doing this as kind of a call to action that Native Americans had lost so much land over the centuries that they're going to reclaim this land from the federal government. And this occupation went on for about 18 months. Authorities cut power and water and all the other utilities in this area. And eventually the protesters dwindled and were finally removed. But again, they were taking a stand that we are going to, we're not going to leave this spot. This is going to be our land. And we're basically taking land back from the government that took our land many years ago. A more dramatic example of the American Indian movement comes in 1973. So there was in the city's exaggerate, small town of Wounded Knee, South Dakota, there was an armed occupation of that town by Native Americans. Now, a little bit of historical background, why Wounded Knee. This was the site of the final massacre of the Indian Wars, the Wounded Knee Massacre, sometimes known as the Wounded Knee Battle. It was just a awful conclusion of the Indian Wars, where dozens of men, women, and children were gunned down by the Federal Army. And so this place has a lot of significance and has a lot of sort of pain, I guess if you might call it, in the psyche of Native Americans. And so this area was occupied. It leads to a armed standoff, and several people were killed or wounded before the standoff was eventually ended. 1975, the federal government passes something called the Indian Self-Determination Act. What this does is it gives Native Americans, returns to them, I should say, a lot of their tribal sovereignty that had been chipped away and lost over the years. So it's going to give them more control over how they handle their own land, having tribal governments set up, how they can have their own form of governments there, have their own police forces and so forth. So basically it's just a way of allowing Native Americans to have more freedom over the control of their lands that they control in the reservation system. All right, let's go on now and look at feminism a little bit. And we're going to look at 1966 as the year a new organization was established called NOW, which stands for National Organization for Women. And one of the founders of this movement was Betty Friedan. You might remember her name. She was the one who authored The Feminine Mystique, which was a book that kind of set off the women's rights movement, the modern women's rights movement. Anyways, it was kind of a rejection, basically, of the cult of domesticity that was so strong in the 1950s. And the goal of NOW was to give women more freedom, more equality, more job opportunities in America. So there may have been jobs that legally weren't closed to women, but women just were never hired for these jobs. Or there were certain jobs that men just didn't see women ever really needing to do. And so NOW is going to step up and say, well, no, women should have all the same economic opportunities that men have, and we shouldn't close the door to half the population. Now, because of NOW and other women's groups, progress is being made. In 1972, for example, Congress passes something known as Title IX. And what Title IX said was that going forward, that we're not going to give any money to any educational program that prohibits, that allows gender discrimination. So in other words, let's say there was a university that said, well, we don't want to have women having in the student government or something. That's not, only men can be in the student government. Well, if they're getting money from the federal government's going to say, well, we're going to cut that money out unless you allow women in student government as well. And so this is going to level the playing field to allow women and men the same educational opportunities. And a good example of a legacy of this would be the growth and, honestly, the birth and growth of women's athletics. So if you went back to the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, the idea of a typical high school having equal boys and girls sports would have been absolutely ridiculous. That would have never happened in most schools. So it's only because of Title IX that schools were forced to fund girls' athletics did we really see the rise in things like softball teams and basketball teams and you name it for girls' sports. All right, now let's talk about a potential addition to the Constitution called the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA. And you can see the text of this proposed amendment. It said that equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex, by which they mean, of course, gender. Now, for a constitutional amendment to be added, you would have to have 38 state legislatures pass this amendment or approve of it, and then it would become part of the Constitution. And let's see if that happens. Well, you can see states that had, in fact, approved of this potential amendment to the ERA, and then you can see states in the lighter color here that were opposed and rejected the ERA. So let's think about why there would be opposition to something called the Equal Rights Amendment. I mean, it sounds very positive, right? Well, there were many political conservatives and social conservatives who said, well, wait a minute, let's look at this ERA thing. And they brought up objections to it. Part of this was a legal objection that it wasn't even necessary because the 14th Amendment already guarantees equal protection of the laws. So why would you need to pass another law saying basically the same thing? That was one argument against the ERA. Other arguments against the ERA was that this would continue to politicize the family, and men and women would be driven apart, and the traditional family as we know it would begin to be dismantled and undermined and weakened by the ERA. People who were against the ERA also said that this would then allow women to serve in combat because, again, equal rights, and that's something that they didn't want to see. They also feared that the ERA would be used one day to legalize gay marriage. Now, the strongest voice in opposition to the ERA, ironically enough, was a woman. Her name was Phyllis Schlafly. And she was very persuasive, and she was outspoken in her opposition to the ERA, and she mobilizes people in opposition against it. And the ERA failed to ever become part of the Constitution, just fell three states short of the needed number to become part of the Constitution. So the ERA died in 1982. There's been talk about reviving this. But a lot of the arguments against it still remain, that maybe it's not really legally necessary because, again, there are already plenty of constitutional rights protecting women. Is this necessary? That's the big criticism of this. All right, now speaking of changes for women in relationship to the government, we come to one of the most controversial court cases in all of American history. There are court cases that lead into this one, and there are court cases that have since changed this ruling a little bit. But this is the one we all need to remember. It's called Roe versus Wade, Roe v. Wade. And what Roe v. Wade did, in effect, was legalize abortions in America. Now, before this, there were state laws prohibiting abortions in most states. I believe some states allowed it different, given the circumstances and so forth. But this is going to be a blanket saying that, no state can ban abortions, basically. And the rationale behind this was that Supreme Court justices argued that women had a right to privacy. Now, right to privacy is not actually mentioned in the Constitution anywhere, but it was one of those things that the justices basically believed that were implied in the Constitution, that you have your right to privacy, and therefore the government has no authority over what you do in terms of medical practices. What you do is between you and your doctor, not between the government and you. And so that was the legal basis of Roe v. Wade. As I mentioned, this is obviously a very controversial issue. It's one of those things where it's hard to have an actual conversation with somebody about it because most people are kind of entrenched in their ideas. Either they're dead set against abortion or they are dead set against limiting women in their ability to have an abortion. So you can see the numbers here over the years. Not much really has changed. Our feelings on abortion have been relatively steady. The majority of Americans believe that it should be legal only under certain circumstances, and then the percentage of Americans who believe it should be illegal in all circumstances, again, really hasn't changed. It's kind of gone down a little bit and then come back up, and so this is kind of where we're at. All right, one more topic, guys, we're going to look at in terms of the movement towards equality and acceptance is what we're going to simply call the gay rights movement. Now, this is something that really gets started in 1969. There was a well-known gay bar in New York City called the Stonewall Inn. And the police came and raided the bar, and there was a violent clash between the patrons and the police. And it really kind of gave rise to a more energetic and just active resistance, I guess we might say, to government discrimination against gay Americans. And in the 1960s and 70s, what we're going to see is a major shift away from criminalizing homosexuality. So you can look at the map here, decriminalization of same-sex sexual intercourse in the United States, and you can see that up until 2003, the yellow states, that was still illegal. And then other states as early as 1962 had decriminalized those acts. And of course, just because this law is passed doesn't mean instantly all Americans were going to accept gay Americans equally. That is something, of course, discrimination will continue through decades after this, and I'm sure you could probably argue still may be around today in certain ways, for sure. All right, so 1960s and 70s, guys, we looked at several different groups and how they were pursuing equality and acceptance in America. We looked at Latin Americans, Native Americans, feminists. We looked at gay Americans. And, equality and progress is on the march in the 1960s and 70s.